You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello, my name is Rachel Ichniowski, and I'm here today with Elvia Wilk, who recently wrote a series of articles for Freeze magazine about abuse of power in the art world and sexual harassment and sexual assault. The most recent piece was just released a few weeks ago, and it was titled The Grammar of Work. Can we start off with you giving a quick summary of what your text is about?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I will try to summarize briefly. The reason I chose grammar as a framework to talk about abuse in the art world was because I wanted to make a distinction between the verb to work and the noun artwork. And that allowed me to pick apart relationality in a historical sense and ask the question, who gets to be evaluated on the qualities, like supposed thing in itself quality of the art object, and who doesn't get to exclude their life and their body from an evaluation of their work. And that was one way of thinking about what I call the question of Carl Andre's rocks, which is a simplified stand-in question to, struggle with the thing in itself problem. Like, can we think about his rocks in a vacuum? And if not, why? And ultimately, this was a way of getting to the question of how to hold abusive artists and others to account without symbolically holding the objects they create hostage, and rather sort of structurally overturning institutional power relationships that allow them to continue doing things and actually stopping abuse rather than cutting off objects from display.
There's a couple of things there that I think are interesting and worth discussing. One that you brought up is specifically with Carl Andre. I think you mentioned in the article that he particularly wanted to have his work removed from any sort of context, which isn't really possible, because even when you think about something like where a work is viewed or how it's displayed, all that context is involved. But at the same time, so many male artists are kind of just given a free pass on like any personal things going on in their lives, and that's never discussed in terms of their work. Their work kind of gets to be, oh, here's this wonderful painting, or here's this great, fantastic thing, and not, oh, but she also does this, female artists or, artists of color. I don't kind of get that.
Yeah. In the article, I talk about Louise Bourgeois, who I've often read accounts of her behavior and use words used like monstrosity to describe her, but also in a lot of my research about so-called outsider art, where people who are not originally included in the canon by dint of who they are or their professional pedigree, instead of talking about, quote, the thing in itself, their art products, we talk about their life as a way of explaining what they do. So to me, it's ultimately an issue of who gets to leave the life out of the work and who doesn't. Mm-hmm. So it seems like Andre's apologists specifically want him to have his relationality and eat it too, meaning that he gets to have interactive contextual artwork, but the context ends when we talk about his life story. And I really don't think his life story is the only story. I think we have to talk about it in every way, aesthetically analyzing artworks, but the story of a life is by no means irrelevant. Even if we think it should be, it's not. We have wall texts and we know when they're born, and we often obsess about how the biography influences the work.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting, too, that you chose Carl Andre, because this isn't a new thing that's come up in the past couple months. But also with him specifically, he did go to trial and he was acquitted. And I know a lot of detractors of the Me Too movement have complained that a lot of this is seen as a witch hunt and that people haven't actually been accused of crimes that they've gone to trial for. And I mean, that will happen in due course, but kind of people still are protesting Carl Andre shows or supporting them. And he's still getting shown regularly. And it's not to say that he can't be. I guess it's just the choice of the curators to show this work. But on that note, I want to bring Chuck Close into the conversation since he's an artist who has been accused of sexual harassment recently. And curious to see like why you chose to bring Carl Andre into this conversation rather than something more recent.
Right. Partially, I was really interested in showing that these debates have a history. And a lot of the problems we're confronting are not totally dissimilar from problems that women and others have been dealing with for a really long time. And we have a lot to learn from that. I think it's really tempting to talk about the Me Too moment as if it's this singular uprising of attention to abusive power. But there is a long history of that. I do talk about more recent examples eventually in the essay, but I think the fact that Carl Andre has so often become the gold standard example is itself interesting and the reason why I brought it up. Mainly, I had written a precursor article that was much more timely about what was happening when Me Too began, and also the We Are Not Surprised letter that was signed by a lot of people in the art world. And I guess every time I had a conversation about that article, somebody was like, but what about Carl Andre? And often, what about Heidegger? Which is in philosophy, for some reason, he's also the guy that always comes up. Anyway, Andre is a flawed example, but the flaws in the example point to a lot of the problems that we're having. So I think the fact that his artwork is shown is actually not a bad thing. The fact that it's shown allows us to talk about this stuff, which is why I'm also, I think I don't advocate for necessarily hiding stuff. And I rather advocate for contextualization that is active and doesn't neglect the complexities of the history. But yes, when you bring up Chuck Close, we definitely bump up against the same problem. So, I mean, with Carl Andre, he did have due process and he was acquitted, and that is definitely part of the context that shouldn't be left out of the story. When we talk about Chuck Close, I guess the question that I ask there is sort of how can we change the ethical code of the art world as to what's permissible rather than the moral inclinations of a specific guy. So while he said he didn't know that he had done anything wrong, probably in a culture that doesn't tolerate abuse of power ethically, he would know that he had done something wrong. And so that's why overhauling the ethical structures, hopefully through legal guidelines and all sorts of institutional work, will actually lead to individuals adjusting their moral compasses and their feelings of accountability.
Yeah, I think it's definitely bringing a lot of awareness to a lot of people. And it's rather than it being maybe something that's very accusatory and limiting in that, like, oh, this person is wrong, let's write them off. Like, we can't show this artist anymore. It's better to have the conversation about, well, what is right and what is wrong, and why is it wrong to treat the things a certain way, or to treat a person a certain way, or to say a certain thing to someone. And with Chuck Close, I know that his apology was probably, I mean, this is just my own comment on it. It seemed genuine, that he probably didn't really understand his role in the situation. And I think that that's a problem with it's not a problem with everyone that we're talking about now, but it's definitely something that I think that some people don't realize the extent of their power and what saying something to someone. And I'm sure that the women who interacted with Chuck Close felt pressured by his power that he didn't realize that he was necessarily wielding over them. So the other thing with Chuck Close that I find interesting was that he was supposed to have a solo show at the National Gallery in DC that has been postponed. But there was already an exhibition of his work up, and I believe it's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art that had it up. And people were asking them to take it down and the show early. And they decided not to, but instead had an exhibition alongside it to kind of put some context into the situation. I believe it was just an exhibition of female artists. And also I think that there was an installation where people could react and it was like on view for other visitors of the museum. And bringing back to that context of things like, okay, so we know this about Chuck Close now. How can we bring that context into this exhibition and continue to show his work in the art historical canon?
I think that's a great example, and that you make a lot of good points. I think, as you said at the beginning, if women had felt like they could, well, women and other people had felt like they had some sort of right or power to say something to him in the moment or refrain from participating in whatever he was doing to them, then he would have known that he was doing something wrong. So making that allowed is important. I think in the essay, the most recent essay, I talk about the idea of actively putting withdrawal in the world, which is a quote from a piece by David Bourguignon, I think his name is pronounced, who wrote for the New York Times about the fact that there shouldn't really be a dichotomy between removing artwork and insisting that it needs to be shown. And I argue that that's a false understanding of object power, which is that either it's morally bad, hide it, or it's by default morally good, don't remove it. So this idea of actively putting withdrawal in the world is the idea that you could remove something or move it temporarily and use that as a premise for conversation. And I think the other step to that, as you say, is that it opens up a platform, or it creates a platform to show work by underrepresented people. So withdrawing something by Chuck Close probably only becomes meaningful when it becomes a forum for conversation and a platform for other people who might not have ever been shown because he was taking up too much space to have an opportunity to show their work.
Yeah. And I think that with artwork, it's a little bit different than, say, like, for example, if I want to go back and watch an old Louis C.K. special, that's on me. That's my choice to like do that. It's already been created. He might make some residual money from that. I'm not really sure. But with an artist's work, I'm not necessarily going to see that unless it's in a museum or a gallery. So if an institution decides to give someone the space for that, they are making a statement, much more so than how an individual is interacting with a work. Yes, you are still to some extent, but not on the same level, I think, as like giving someone the space and the attention for other people to view it.
Absolutely. That's the Woody Allen spiral of how can I resist this in the privacy of my own home? Should I pirate his work so as not to indirectly support him? You could really torture yourself with these questions, and I have, especially because I find myself having an affective, emotional response when I find out that somebody I admire has, in the process of producing that work, caused harm, especially because I'm increasingly believing and arguing that those things aren't fully separable if you think of work as a verb. I also talk about the example of Sonia Boyce, who moved a Victorian painting called Hylas and the Nymphs from the Manchester Art Gallery, which was painted in 1896 by John William Waterhouse. And in place of the painting, she allowed visitors to add Post-it notes on their opinion on displaying that kind of work, which is just sort of a typical image of naked ladies tempting a Greek figure to his death, which, again, it doesn't address the problem of what to do with living artists and how to keep them from benefiting or profiting off of their work. But it does bring up this question of moving versus removal and taking things out of circulation in order to encourage debate rather than trying to shut it down. which allows you to think about censorship and what really constitutes censorship, which I think a lot of what's happening is not trying is a lot of the current efforts are not aiming to stop the conversation, but rather to encourage it, which I think is what Boyce did. So that's an example of actively putting withdrawal in the world.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting bringing up this example because, this is a painting from a little over 100 years ago. And the question of, well, what do we do with historical figures and how do we treat them? How do we learn about them? How do we talk about them? What space are they given in a museum or a gallery or in books? But that also then comes back to like what you were saying about underrepresentation and also to context. When we think about historical artists, like what was the context of the world they were living in? What was the context of what was happening and what was being discussed? But also in that vein, white men were given a lot more opportunities and were the ones who were making things that people were talking about. They were given press. They were given exhibitions. They were given pretty much everything and all the opportunity. So, with like Linda Nochlund's article, famous article,
right?
There are no great women artists because there was no opportunity to be represented as such.
Right.
Not that they weren't good or great. That just wasn't how it was. So moving forward, we can change things, but it's still hard to know how do we look back at what's already happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without a room of your own, it's very hard to create. And without a forum for exhibition, it's very hard to be recognized. I would say that the Hylas and the Nymphs painting just underscores the power of representation, both of the artists and also the representation literally in the imagery and in visual art. Obviously, you can't evaluate these things ahistorically from a contemporary vantage point. But, even in the 70s, when Carl Andre was launching his career, much more recent history, you have a kind of pervasive and persistent refusal to show women and women's work. Equal representation is a recent problem. And it's still, there are all sorts of statistics about, like, you get an extreme discount if you buy women's art on auction because it's so much cheaper, and the amount of museum space and gallery sales that women get. The statistics are just really bad. So it's a persistent problem. I think I've been reading a book called The Problem of Work by a scholar called Kathy Weeks from, I guess, 7 years ago. It was published. And she talks about the difference between equality and freedom, and the fact that equal representation is certainly a goal that needs to be strived for and reached. But beyond that, we can't forget the idea of freedom from work entirely and work society being part of the problem, and capitalist production standards being wound up in these problems. And that as much as we need equal representation, we should also always return to the 1970s and 80s debates about whether or not we should rather overturn capitalism than seek for more work and compensation for work, and also compensation for the uncompensated affective labor that women always do and continue to do. But we should also think about total liberation from these structures rather than simply equality. And I've been thinking a lot about what that might look like in the sphere of artistic production, and I don't know.
In that context, recently it was Equal Pay Day, which was when it's the day in the year that women will have earned as much as men in the previous year. And there's been a lot of interesting articles that have come up about emotional labor or non-traditional labor that women do on top of the regular work. And this might be a nice time to bring up Meryl Latterman, you Kellys.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. She's really influential on my thinking and the thinking of a lot of people, I think. So in 1973, Merrill wrote a manifesto called the Manifesto for Maintenance Art, which is just a brilliant text about the fact that her immaterial labor, especially in the private sphere, in the home, was, despite the fact that it was repetitive and fit the bill of a lot of minimalist and institutionally critical work of male artists at the time, was not folded into what we consider artistic production. So it didn't produce the future, it didn't produce capital value in the obvious way that commodity production does. And yet, as a lot of feminist theorists like Silvia Federici have long argued, that kind of immaterial labor is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of capitalism. So anyway, in her maintenance manifesto, she points out that all of the washing and cleaning and baby rearing and feeding the family that she and women have always done could just be relocated to the museum, and magically it might transmute into something else. So she did a lot of projects like washing the museum floor and locking various rooms of the museum to designate them as exhibition spaces. And she also has long worked with maintenance workers, such as allowing the maintenance workers in a museum to designate their daily work as art whenever, for a period of time that they chose. These are experiments in giving agency to people who don't necessarily get recognized as producing value within the institution. So to tie that back to the idea of the noun and the verb, she did verbs and allowed us to consider them as nouns with an end value. So a means to an end, and the end being institutional criticism in this case. I also think that the ability of male artists to exit care relations whenever they see fit or whenever it doesn't serve their agenda is always important to return to. So women don't generally get the chance to quit the social relations of the museum as a form of institutional critique. They're trapped within them. So what can we do in that space, the space of being trapped? Let me just say one more thing. So often when I talk about these things, I use gender pronouns like he and she. And I just want to reiterate that these problems are so much worse for women of color, so much worse for trans people, and statistically for non-binary people. And intersectionality is a word that's thrown around a lot. And it's one way of talking about that, but I think it's often misused. And I would just want to call attention to the idea that intersectionality is important not just because it allows an examination of class and race structures among female-identified people and non-binary people, but also because only by addressing those differences within that category can everyone actually benefit.
Very true. Yeah, this is not a conversation that is going to come to any kind of conclusion because we're in the midst of what's happening right now. But I think that we can agree that there's things that institutions can do, there's things that individuals can do moving forward, and mostly it's to just keep talking about it and to kind of see where we can go with, like, I guess pointing out problems when we see them is one thing, and also maybe making a more conscious effort to give space and attention to underrepresented artists.
I agree. There's no way to wrap it up. I fluctuate between hope and lack of hope pretty frequently, as I think most of us do. On an individual level, I always say there are sort of basic things that one can do, simply refusing to participate in forums where there might be a total imbalance of representation. If you have the choice to make a statement about that or to boycott those places, you probably should, or suggest that they're more inclusive. And I think we also just can always look at our own like start locally, like start
Yeah.
at home. So the place that you work or your own relationships, those aren't insignificant.
No.
And ultimately, that's where so-called structural change can start.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.